Normandy, August 1944. The Allied breakout from the bocage is grinding forward through shattered villages and cratered roads. German resistance is collapsing in some sectors, hardening in others. Amid the chaos, Wehrmacht units are surrendering in clusters, sometimes entire companies at once, their officers negotiating terms with American and British forces who barely have the resources to process them all. On August 17th, near the town of Falaise, elements of the U.S. 90th Infantry Division capture what remains of a German communications unit attached to the 2nd SS Panzer Division. 43 men, exhausted and disarmed, are marched to a temporary holding area in a farmer's field. Among them is Oberleutnant Martin Schroeder, a signals officer responsible for coordinating encrypted radio traffic between panzer units during the battle. Schroeder wasn't a name that appeared in intelligence briefings or on wanted lists. No political connections, no SS affiliation, no war crimes on his record. He was technical personnel, a specialist, born 1916 in Hamburg, degree in electrical engineering from Technical University of Berlin, 1938, commissioned into the Wehrmacht Signals Corps in 1940, posted to France in 1941, then transferred to the Eastern Front in 1942, decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class for maintaining communications during the retreat from Kharkov, reassigned to France in early 1944 as Allied invasion preparations became evident. His personnel file, recovered decades later from captured Wehrmacht archives in Berlin, shows a career trajectory that raised no alarms. His commanding officer's assessment from March 1944 described him as competent but withdrawn, politically indifferent, focused exclusively on technical matters. He managed encryption equipment, coordinated frequency assignments, and troubleshot breakdowns in field communications. The kind of work that kept armies functioning but left no dramatic stories behind. Within hours of capture, Schroeder is separated from the other prisoners and taken to a different compound. Standard procedure for officers with intelligence value. U.S. Army intelligence personnel conduct the initial questioning. Name, rank, unit, last orders received. Schroeder answers calmly, precisely, offering nothing beyond what is required by the Geneva Convention. But something happens during the second interrogation on August 19th. The session is conducted not by regular Army intelligence, but by a civilian wearing an unmarked uniform, later identified in fragmentary OSS records as J. Mitchell, Field Operative, Communication Security Section. No transcript of this interrogation survives. What does survive is a brief notation in the prisoner transfer log. Schroeder, Martin. Transferred to special holding per OSS request, 1830 hours, August 19th. The other 42 men from his unit remain in the standard POW processing system. They are eventually transported to camps in England, then later to the United States. Their fates are documented, their repatriation dates recorded. Their names appear in rosters, medical logs, and work assignment sheets. Schroeder's name disappears from the POW rosters entirely. A week after his capture, a report filed by the commanding officer of the 2nd SS Panzer Division's Signals Battalion, written from a British POW camp, mentions Schroeder by name. The report, declassified in 1979, accuses Schroeder of suspected collaboration with enemy forces and recommends investigation for treason. The accusation is vague. No specifics. No evidence. Just suspicion, the kind that grows in defeat when explanations are needed for why communications failed, why units couldn't coordinate, why the battle was lost. The report is forwarded through British intelligence channels to American counterparts. A handwritten note in the margin, dated September 2nd, 1944, reads, "Subject already in OSS custody. Matter being handled separately. No further action required." No explanation of what being handled separately meant. No clarification of why a captured German signals officer would be of interest to the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, rather than standard military intelligence. And then silence. Schroeder's name does not appear on lists of war criminals. He is not charged with treason by German military courts after the war. He is not mentioned in the Nuremberg proceedings or any subsequent trials. His Wehrmacht personnel file contains no notation of his capture, his interrogation, or his fate. For all official purposes, Oberleutnant Martin Schroeder ceased to exist on August 19, 1944. German POW records maintained by the Allies were meticulous. Thousands of names, serial numbers, camp assignments, work details, medical treatments, deaths, and repatriations. Every man accounted for, even if only to note that he had died in custody or been released. Schroeder appears in the initial capture log. He vanishes from every record after that. His former comrades, interviewed decades later by historians researching Wehrmacht signals operations, offered contradictory accounts. Some remembered him as quiet, professional, uninterested in politics or ideology. Others recalled him asking unusual questions about Allied radio procedures, about encryption vulnerabilities, about how long German codes might remain secure under cryptanalysis. One former colleague, interviewed in 1987 for an oral history project, said something that stayed with the interviewer. "We always wondered if Martin knew the war was lost before the rest of us did. He seemed prepared for it." Why? If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Allies faced an administrative nightmare. Millions of displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of POWs, entire populations on the move across a shattered continent. Repatriation efforts stretched for years. Men were lost in the bureaucracy, their files misfiled, their identities confused with others who shared common names. Martin Schroeder's disappearance could have been just another administrative error, except that people were looking for him. In 1946, the French government, conducting its own investigation into German intelligence operations during the occupation, requested information on Schroeder. They had found references to his unit in captured German communications logs and wanted to question him about Wehrmacht signal security procedures used in France, particularly regarding suspected breaches of German communications that had aided the resistance. The request, filed through official diplomatic channels, received a response from U.S. Army intelligence in March 1946. Subject Martin Schroeder, former Oberleutnant, whereabouts unknown, believed repatriated to British zone, 1945. No current information available. The British, when contacted through proper channels, had no record of receiving Schroeder or repatriating him to Germany. The French filed a follow-up inquiry. No response came. In 1952, a researcher working for the West German government's Office of Military Records noted an unusual entry in a list of former Wehrmacht personnel who had emigrated after the war. A Martin Schroeder, born 1916 Hamburg, listed as having departed for Canada in 1948 on a displaced person's visa issued through the International Refugee Organization. But the documentation was incomplete. No photograph, no fingerprints, no forwarding address or destination city. The departure point was listed as Bremen, in the American zone of occupation, but Canadian immigration records from that period, when cross-referenced years later, showed no entry for anyone matching Schroeder's name, birth year, and documented military service. The researcher flagged the discrepancy in a routine report. The file was forwarded to the Foreign Office in Bonn. No action was taken. The file was marked insufficient information for follow-up and archived. In 1959, the U.S. National Archives received a routine request from a doctoral student at Princeton researching Wehrmacht communication security during the Normandy campaign. Among the files he requested was the interrogation record of Oberleutnant Martin Schroeder, captured August 1944, believed it provided tactical intelligence on German signals procedures. The response, delivered 6 months later after multiple follow-up inquiries, stated, "Requested materials classified under national security exemption. Access denied pending review." The student, frustrated but not surprised, classification was common for intelligence materials from the war, moved on to other sources. He noted the denial in his dissertation footnotes, but drew no particular conclusions from it. Plenty of wartime intelligence files remained classified in 1959. It seemed routine. What he didn't know was that the classification was not routine. Internal National Archive correspondence, declassified only in 2018 as part of a separate FOIA lawsuit, shows that the student's request triggered an inquiry to the Central Intelligence Agency, which responded. Materials related to subject Schroeder remained sensitive to ongoing operations. Continued classification recommended. Review not authorized at this time. Why would a captured Wehrmacht officer's interrogation records, 15 years after the war ended, be considered sensitive to ongoing CIA operations? Over the decades, fragments of information emerged from different sources, each contradicting the others or adding layers of ambiguity. A former OSS officer interviewed for an oral history project in 1973 mentioned in passing that his unit had run a few German signals people after capture, guys who knew their crypto systems inside out. When asked for names or details, he said he couldn't remember specific cases. When pressed harder by the interviewer, he said the operations were classified and he wasn't authorized to discuss them even decades later. A West German intelligence officer, writing his memoirs in 1981, claimed that several former Wehrmacht signal specialists had been quietly recruited by Western intelligence services after the war to help decrypt Soviet communications systems that had been developed from captured German equipment. He didn't name Schroeder specifically, but the timeline and operational details matched what little was known about Schroeder's background. A Soviet intelligence document, obtained by Western services in 1989 during the chaos following collapse of the USSR, referenced a turned German communications officer who had provided critical information to the Americans during and immediately after the war, intelligence that had compromised Soviet signal security in occupied Germany. The name was redacted. The context and date suggested the betrayal had occurred in France in 1944. None of these accounts confirmed anything definitively, but together they sketched the outline of something larger, a pattern of recruitment, of protection, of institutional silence maintained across decades, governments, and classification systems. By the 1980s, historians researching Wehrmacht signals operations in Normandy occasionally encountered Schroeder's name in footnotes, cross-references, and marginal notations in captured German documents. He was always described the same way: captured August 1944, fate unknown. Some assumed he had died in a POW camp, and the records had been lost in the administrative chaos. Others speculated he had been one of the many Germans who simply disappeared into the post-war displacement, adopting new identities and new lives far from Europe. But the complete absence of any confirmation of his death was strange. POW death records, even in the chaos of 1945, were generally thorough. Men who died of disease, accident, or violence in custody were documented, their graves marked, their deaths reported through Red Cross channels to German authorities. And Schroeder had been a healthy 28-year-old officer when captured, not someone likely to die suddenly without record. The silence wasn't accidental. It was too consistent, too complete across too many archives and agencies. Records that should have existed didn't. Requests for information were denied or deflected with vague references to national security. Archives that should have contained his file claimed they had nothing, or that materials had been destroyed, or that they had been transferred to another agency that couldn't be identified. It was the kind of silence that suggested not forgetting, but management, active, deliberate, maintained across institutional boundaries and generations of archivists. Dr. Elena Richter was not looking for Martin Schroeder specifically. She was researching Operation Tickum, the Allied program to capture German signals intelligence personnel and cryptographic equipment at the end of World War II, then exploit their expertise for Western intelligence purposes. A specialist in intelligence history at the University of Bonn, Richter had spent years piecing together the story of how the Allies had systematically identified, captured, and employed German experts in the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union. It was painstaking work. Many Tickum files remain classified even in 2019. Those that have been released were heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out, names removed, operational details obscured. She had to cross-reference American, British, and German archives, looking for patterns in what was revealed and what remained hidden, reconstructing operations from fragments scattered across institutional boundaries. In 2019, while working through newly declassified OSS files at the U.S. National Archives in College Park, Maryland, she found a memo dated September 1944 marked Tickum Preliminary Assessment, Captured German Signals Personnel, France Sector. The memo listed 12 names. Officers and technicians who have been identified during interrogations as having valuable knowledge of Wehrmacht communication systems, German military codes, and Enigma machine operations. Beside each name was a brief notation. Suitable for exploitation or limited value, routine knowledge only. The 8th name was Oberleutnant Martin Schroeder. The notation read, suitable for exploitation, subject cooperative. Preliminary debriefing indicates extensive knowledge of Enigma variants, Wehrmacht frequency management protocols, and Eastern Front Soviet signals intelligence procedures. Recommend transfer to London for detailed technical interrogation. Cooperative. The word suggested something beyond compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. It suggested active assistance. Richter requested corresponding files from the UK National Archives at Kew. After the standard bureaucratic delays, multiple follow-up requests, and intervention by her university's research liaison, she received a partial release. Most pages were still redacted, entire sections blacked out, but enough remained to see the outline of the story. Schroeder had been transferred to England in late September 1944. He was held not in a standard POW camp, but at a secure facility in the countryside outside London, a manor house requisitioned by British intelligence and used for high-value technical debriefings. Over the following months, he was interrogated extensively about German communication security, encryption procedures, signals intelligence operations on both the Western and Eastern fronts, and Wehrmacht assessments of Allied cryptanalytic capabilities. A report dated December 1944, with most of the substantive content still redacted, concluded, subject has provided valuable intelligence on German cryptographic procedures and equipment vulnerabilities. Information has been shared with U.S. and U.K. signals intelligence agencies and has already proven operationally useful. Subject continues to cooperate fully without coercion. Recommend retention for duration of hostilities and assessment for possible post-war employment in technical advisory capacity. Post-war employment. The phrase stood out. It suggested planning for something beyond the immediate war, beyond victory over Germany. It suggested recruitment. The breakthrough came in 2024, when the CIA released another batch of Cold War-era documents under a federal court order following years of litigation by transparency advocates. Buried in routine operational files from the Office of Communications was a memo dated March 1949. The memo discussed a recruitment and employment status of former Axis signals intelligence personnel who had been brought into classified American programs to assist in monitoring Soviet communications. It mentioned that several German specialists had been brought to the United States under classified arrangements, provided with new identities and security clearances, and were working as contractors for various intelligence agencies. One paragraph, with portions still redacted, read, Subject Schroeder Martin, former Wehrmacht Oberleutnant, recruited in 1944 France, continues to provide valuable technical analysis of Soviet military communications procedures and equipment. Subject's extensive knowledge of German-Soviet signals intelligence operations on Eastern Front during 1942 to 43 period, particularly useful for current assessment of Soviet capabilities. Current assignment, redacted. Security status, protected. Recommend continued employment under existing cover arrangement through at least 1950. Schroeder hadn't disappeared into post-war chaos. He hadn't died in a POW camp. He hadn't been repatriated to Germany to fade into civilian life. He had been working for American intelligence for 5 years by 1949. And the memo's reference to recruited in 1944 France suggested his cooperation had begun not after Germany's defeat, but during the war, possibly from the moment of his capture. Richter assembled the pieces methodically, building a timeline from fragmentary evidence. Schroeder had been captured in August 1944. Within days, OSS officers had identified him as having valuable technical intelligence. He had been cooperative, providing detailed information about German communication systems, apparently without the coercion or pressure typically applied to reluctant prisoners. He had been transferred to England for more extensive technical debriefing. At some point, the relationship had shifted from interrogation to recruitment. After the war, he had been brought to the United States under classified arrangements and put to work analyzing Soviet communications. But when had the cooperation actually begun? The document suggested it had started immediately after capture. But Richter found something that complicated that narrative, that suggested an even earlier timeline. In a footnote in a declassified British Signals Intelligence report from 1947, discussing German communication security failures during the Normandy campaign, there was a reference to advanced intelligence provided by a source within Wehrmacht signals operations in France, August 1944, which enabled rapid exploitation of captured Enigma materials. The timeline suggested that Schroeder might have been providing information before his official capture, that his surrender might not have been a capture at all, but an extraction, a planned defection disguised as battlefield surrender. In 2024, Richter published her findings in a peer-reviewed intelligence history journal. The article carefully documented Schroeder's capture, his recruitment by Allied intelligence, his post-war work for American agencies, and the decades of classification that had hidden his story from public knowledge and historical scholarship. The response was muted. A few academic journals ran follow-up articles. Intelligence historians debated the implications in conferences and seminars, but the broader public barely noticed. By 2024, revelations about former Nazi personnel recruited by Western intelligence were no longer shocking. Operation Paperclip and the Gehlen organization were well documented. The pattern was familiar, but crucial questions remained unanswered, protected by continued classification. When exactly had Schroeder decided to cooperate with the Allies? Had he been approached by Allied intelligence while still actively serving in the Wehrmacht? Had he provided information that directly led to German military defeats? Or had his cooperation begun only after capture, a pragmatic decision made in the face of obvious German defeat? The accusation of suspected collaboration made by his commanding officer in August 1944 suggested that someone had noticed something unusual about Schroeder's behavior or performance before his capture. But what exactly had he done? Had he deliberately compromised German communications? Had he provided intelligence that cost German lives? Richter filed additional FOIA requests with U.S. and British intelligence agencies, seeking the full interrogation transcripts, operational assessments, and employment records that would answer these questions. The responses, when they finally came after months of bureaucratic delay, were identical in substance. Additional materials related to subjects Schroeder remained classified under national security exemptions. Declassification review ongoing. No release date scheduled at this time. In her research files, Richter found one more piece of evidence, overlooked in earlier reviews. A 1962 memo from a national security agency, the American Signals Intelligence Agency, that had absorbed many OSS and wartime intelligence functions, discussing the retirement packages for long-term contractors who had worked on classified Cold War communications projects. One line mentioned M. Schroeder, contractor since 1944, and noted his 18 years of continuous service to U.S. signals intelligence operations. The memo recommended a pension and severance package commensurate with his long service and specialized expertise. It was marked confidential, but had been declassified in 2010 as part of a routine review of decades-old administrative documents. The memo confirmed that Schroeder had worked for American intelligence from 1944 through at least 1962, 18 years of continuous service. But it revealed nothing about what happened to him after retirement, where he had lived, or when he had died. Richter searched for death records in Germany, the United States, Canada, anywhere a Martin Schroeder born 1916 might have ended up. She found nothing definitive. Multiple men with that name and approximate birth year, but none whose biographical details matched the Wehrmacht signals officer. It was as if he had vanished a second time, this time from civilian life, his final years as obscure as his wartime betrayal. The truth about Martin Schroeder is no longer completely hidden. It's a matter of record now, documented in declassified files, published in academic journals, available to anyone with access to archives and the patience to piece together fragments scattered across institutional boundaries. He was captured in August 1944. He cooperated with Allied intelligence. He provided valuable technical information about German communication systems. He was recruited into American intelligence operations. He worked for U.S. agencies through at least the early 1960s. But the full story remains sealed behind classification barriers. The documents that would answer the crucial questions. When did his cooperation truly begin? What specific intelligence did he provide? Did he actively betray his unit before his capture? How many German soldiers died because of information he gave? Those documents are still classified, still protected by national security exemptions, still waiting for a declassification date that may never come. In 2025, a former CIA officer, speaking on background to journalists researching Cold War intelligence operations and willing to talk only without attribution, said something revealing. The Schroeder case was always sensitive, not because of what he did during the war. That's ancient history now. Everyone's dead. It doesn't matter anymore. But because of what his case represented, the deals we made, the lines we crossed, the people we protected and employed because they were useful to us, regardless of what they'd done before. The officer wouldn't elaborate further. When pressed for specifics, for names, for operational details, he said, some files stay closed because opening them would require explaining why they were closed in the first place. And that explanation, that institutional history of decision-making, is more damaging than the original secret ever was. Richter's research revealed something beyond Schroeder's individual story. In the declassified files, scattered across memos and operational reports, she found references to at least 15 other German signals intelligence personnel who had been recruited by the Allies during or immediately after the war, brought into classified programs, and employed for years in Cold War operations. Most of their names were still redacted. Their individual stories were still classified, their fates unknown. But the pattern was clear. The Allies had systematically identified valuable German experts, separated them from normal POW processing, brought them into intelligence operations, and protected them from prosecution or public exposure. Their cooperation had been purchased with immunity, with employment, with new identities, with silence that stretched across decades. And that silence had been maintained for 80 years, released only in fragments, only when declassification served institutional interests, only when everyone involved was dead and the political consequences had dissolved into historical curiosity. In 2024, several months after her article was published, Richter received an anonymous email. No name, no return address, sent through an encrypted service that left no trace. The message was brief. You're asking about the wrong part of Schroeder's story. The question isn't when he started cooperating. The question is who else was part of his network. Look at the other names captured with him in August 1944. Look at who survived and where they ended up. Not all of them were just lucky. Richter went back to the original capture records. 43 men from Schroeder's communications unit had surrendered that day in August 1944. She began systematically researching what had happened to each of them, tracking them through POW records, repatriation logs, post-war employment records. Most had been processed as normal prisoners, sent to camps, eventually repatriated to Germany between 1946 and 1948. Their post-war lives were documented, ordinary, traceable. But 3 others, in addition to Schroeder, had also been transferred to special holding within weeks of capture. Their names appeared briefly in OSS preliminary assessment documents, then vanished from standard POW records. No repatriation dates. No camp assignments. Just transfers to higher authority and then silence. She filed FOIA requests for their files. The response came faster than usual, as if someone had been waiting for the question. Requested materials classified under national security exemptions. No declassification review authorized. Access denied. 80 years after his capture in a farmer's field in Normandy, Martin Schroeder's story is partially known. He betrayed his unit or his country or his comrades, though exactly when and how and why remains protected by classification and institutional silence. He worked for the intelligence services that defeated Germany, then employed him to monitor the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He was protected, paid, given a new life, and eventually erased from all records. His story was released in pieces, decades apart, each revelation carefully timed and controlled by the agencies that had once employed him. The system that protected him also decided when and how much of the protection would be revealed. But the files still reference names that remain redacted, operations that remain classified, networks that remain hidden, questions that remain unanswered. Because the truth about Martin Schroeder was never just about one man's betrayal or one agency's recruitment decision. It was about how many others like him were identified, turned protected, and hidden. How many deals were made in the shadows of defeat and victory. How many betrayals were forgiven, forgotten, or simply classified because they served purposes that transcended justice or accountability. And whether we'll ever know the complete truth, or only the version that someone, somewhere in an office we'll never identify, decided it was finally safe for us to see. The fields of Normandy are quiet now. The hedgerows overgrown. The farmer's field where 43 men surrendered now marked only by a small memorial to the liberation. No plaque mentions what happened there beyond the obvious facts of battle and surrender. History remembers the invasions, the victories, the defeats. But the smaller moments, the interrogations that became recruitments, the captures that became collaborations, the files sealed to protect not secrets but systems and institutions, and the reputations of agencies that made impossible choices in impossible times. Those remain hidden. Martin Schroeder betrayed his own unit in World War II. 80 years later, part of the truth came out, but only part. And maybe that was always the plan. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.